Hello and welcome from the not virtual Grays of Westminster secondhand department. You may or may not be able to see that I'm actually in the secondhand department. There will also be a few moments of me talking about cameras. I'm just getting used to this change of setup, and I am slightly confused because I have to look there and all your comments are down here. Very, very confusing. I hope you are all well. For those of you that haven't joined us before, welcome. You normally get me in front of a green screen, but today I am physically in the shop. It is a sign that things are changing and that lockdown measures are slightly easing. But yes, I'm in the shop today and I'm going to talk to you about film cameras. It's a topic that lots of people are very excited about. I get very excited about talking about film cameras. To be honest, this morning has been slightly stressful. It's taken us about 3.5 hours to get this set up perfect, but so excuse any lack of, let's say, perfection on my part, but I will do my best. Now, I cannot simply look at the camera and read your comments at the same time, so I'm going to have to look down, and I hope you don't mind. Hello to Terry and Richard and Andy and Drazen and Stephen and Eves and Baxter. Thank you very much, David, for your contribution to the coffee fund. Gales is open down the road, so I am thrilled to pieces. For those of you who aren't subscribers, please do subscribe. And you'll get used to me rambling about technical difficulties. And if you'd like to contribute to the coffee fund, you can do so using Super Chat or the PayPal me link, which we'll include below. Hello to Nick. Looks like, yes, I'm back in the shop. There you go. Look, I can actually touch the things in the shop. So today I'm talking about film cameras. What am I going to say about film cameras? Well, a lot of you probably already have them. I, as you all know, have an FM3A and an F6, which are my beloved and prized possessions. But I also have a passion for other film cameras and I've used a lot of them. And I wanted to talk a little bit, depending on your level of experience and how much you want to spend, or if you're looking for a film camera for, let's say, a loved one or a child or grandchild, niece or nephew, you might want to know what camera you should choose. If it's for you, it's slightly easier because I'm relaying this straight to you and you can decide. No, the shop is not fully open, Nick, to answer that question. We are open for mail orders as we have been for the last few weeks, but I have been streaming from home on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I decided to come into the shop today and stream from in-store because we are starting to need a few more feet on the ground, as it were, to try and keep up with everybody's orders and things like that. So that's why I'm here today. But I didn't want to skip out on my live stream and abandon you all. So here I am. It was a bit touch and go there for a minute. I nearly posted a message saying I cannot get my streaming software to work, but it's working. So, feel sad having to put the 500pf back on the shelf? No, not yet. We're not open yet. I'm keeping the 500pf until we're officially open and allowed to demonstrate cameras and lenses to people. Obviously, it will be fully disinfected. That whole thing is a whole extra evolution, which I'm not quite ready for yet. But we will have to put in, obviously, lots of safety measures and things like that, and probably only have a reduced number of staff and only one person in the shop at a time. So if you are planning to come into the shop when we reopen on the 15th of June, please do contact us beforehand. Don't just turn up, just in case. All right, so just going to read your messages. Good. Okay, we're good to go. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. We all know what this is, right? This, let me see if I can see what you see. There we go. Is a Nikon F. This is the first camera, aside from a rangefinder, the first SLR that Nikon made. A lot of people look at the Nikon F as a kind of timepiece, a bit of history, and that it certainly is. I talked about a week ago, I'm losing track of time, about the pre-AI lenses, and I showed them to you. Those are the ones with the little rabbit ears on them there. Let me just bring that closer to the camera so you can see it. There we go. See the rabbit ears? Okay, so that is a fully fledged pre-AI lens, and they were made for these cameras. They also worked on the Nikon F2s. Now, the reason that I'm showing you a Nikon F is because a lot of people quite like the idea of having the first SLR that Nikon ever made. This one is a plain prism version. So it doesn't have the photomic head on the top, which means there's no meter in it. This is a purely mechanical beast. If you want a meter, you will have to use a handheld light meter or an app. I actually have a light meter app, which I use with quite some success. I will find it in a minute and I'll tell you what it's called. So yeah, I know Aladdin's Cave. I'm actually in the Aladdin's Cave. It feels quite special to me as well to be doing my live stream from the shop, because this is kind of where the whole idea of live streams and videos started. So there you go. So Nikon F produced, they made very, very early few in 1959, but it kind of really started out in 1960. So if you think about it, this camera is 60 years old, and don't expect the meters, if you get a version with a photomic head, don't expect the meters to work perfectly. A few other limitations to these bodies. Obviously, they didn't have all of the film speeds programmed into them. So you, for example, if you're choosing your ASA, this lens is not going to focus close enough. I'm using a Z6 actually to do the live stream today, but I'll read it to you. The highest ISO or ASA that you can program in here is ASA 400. So there was a limitation there. You also had the fact that the fastest shutter speed was 1,000th of a second. So not super fast, particularly if you're limited to programming the right ISO on your film speeds. Now, as we progress through film cameras, we ended up with the F2s. I'm gonna see, I can actually get one out of the cupboard now. So here is, I'm actually gonna pick up an F2A, because then you can get an idea of what the head looks like. Do you see that? That's an F2 with a metered head. And there were F2 plain prism, F2 photomic, no, F2S, SB, F2A, F2AS. So there were at least 4 versions, actually I think 5 versions of this metered head. And the beauty of this was that you could change the heads. Also, you could interchange the heads between the Nikon F and the F2. So if you had an old Nikon F and you wanted the newest metered head, you could still use it. Now, here's a point of interest. The metered heads on the F2s take their electronic contacts from the camera itself. Obviously, if you've got a plain prism head and you put batteries in there, it's going to do nothing. But with the Nikon Fs and F photomics, FTNs, that was the name of the photomic head, one of them, the battery was actually located inside the head itself. So if you changed heads or put batteries and you had to put it inside the head, it had nothing to do with the body. They were completely independent of each other. All right, so Nikon F and F2, your lenses are interchangeable, your heads are actually interchangeable. Not all accessories are interchangeable, but the 2 cameras kind of went side by side quite happily. If you buy an F2, again, I would recommend using a handheld light meter wherever possible. Just because, again, these cameras were produced in the 70s, and you're looking at a sort of a 50-year-old body. Don't expect the meter to be perfect. A lot of people ended up opting for the F2AS because it was the final metered head version. And so people would want to have the most reliable metered option. So if you are looking again at a vintage body, then have a look at an F2AS. The shutter speeds on these bodies went up to 2,000th of a second. You can almost tell the kind of the age of a camera and how much it progressed by the maximum shutter speed. That's how I look at it. As soon as we hit sort of 4,000th of a second, it was like, okay, those cameras are modern by film standards. It sounds like I'm in a boot. That's not good, because I got the same microphone that I use at home. It's just here. It's there instead of in front of my face, unfortunately. I probably need to have a, let's see, a boom mic or something. John, I'm always open to people telling me how to do things. If you have advice on a better setup, let me know. But I'm using exactly the same microphone as I use at home. It's just down there, and obviously the space is much bigger. When I'm streaming from home, I'm streaming from my office, which is it's not as big as a shoebox, but it's definitely more kind of enclosed, and also with the green screen and everything, it's like I'm in a little sound booth. So here I'm in the shop, the ceilings are a little bit higher, everything is a lot more open, so apologies for that. But yes, the picture is very good because I'm shooting on a Z6 straight into the camera. All right, so if there was no meter in the F, why would you need to set the ASA? It's a reminder. It is a reminder. The Nikon Fs, as you can see, they didn't have that little slot in the back to put what kind of film you had in there. And if you're setting your light meter, because you'd have a handheld light meter, right? So you would need to set the ASA into the light meter. What if you didn't pick up your camera for 2 weeks and then forgot what the ASA was in the film you were using? There's that. Also, you know, if you are using a metered head, eventually you would need it. But that's the main reason why, Nick. All right, so then F2, so Nikon F, F2, and then we had the F3. Now the F3, do I have one? Yes, I do. I had to just double check then, because I wasn't sure. So the F3 was considered probably the most versatile of all of Nikon's film cameras. It was designed for reporter photographers, a lot of the guys who were shooting on newspapers and also photojournalism and things like that were using F3s. They had the largest number of accessories of all the Nikon cameras. I actually have it written down somewhere. 160 different accessories, something like that. So this also shot at 2,000th of a second, but it also had, let's see if it will show you a little bit, refocuses. It has an aperture priority mode, which is the little green A there. So if you did want a little bit of automation, the other cameras you just shoot in manual purely. Whereas with this one, you also had an aperture priority option. They're all built very, very solidly. But I would say that the F3 is probably, for those people that wanted something a little bit less historic and maybe a little bit more versatile, would tend to go for an F3. Now, bearing in mind that these are all mechanical cameras. So I'm not talking about the cameras which have autofocus capabilities. I'm going to talk about that again. Well, I'm going to go into AF cameras shortly. The F3 was an 80s camera, and actually they did produce an autofocus version of it called the F3 AF. On top of that, it had its own autofocus lenses. At the same time, Nikon were really trying to branch into the body autofocus kind of realm. So they created a teleconverter called the TC16A. You may have heard of it. Don't know if I've got one. I do. It's great being in the shop. I can just grab stuff off the shelf. Right. So this is a TC16A. This is a 2470, so it doesn't focus super close. It's not quite the same as using a webcam, but there you go. That's a TC16A right there. And what this teleconverter did was rather spectacular. It would take your manual focus lenses and then turn them into autofocus lenses. What? Yeah, so you would put your manual focus lens on there, and then you would put this on usually an AF body, one of the very early AF bodies, and it would actually, using a sort of a screw drive system, power some autofocus for you. It was quite limited in its use. You can't really use it on modern day cameras. There is a friend of the shop, I would say, who's a massive Nikon fan, who actually sent me some instructions on how you dock to these so that they will work on digital cameras. But generally speaking, straight out of the box, they don't work on modern digital cameras to turn your manual lens into an autofocus lens. However, if you do have an older AF body and you've got some manual lenses, then a TC16A, check the compatibility, but the TC16A is the thing that will turn your manual lens into an autofocus lens by magic. And technology. So you had the F3 AF, which was kind of specialized and sat between the F3 and the F4. You also had the TC16A as an option if you wanted autofocus. These days, I would probably not suggest getting an F3 AF unless you are a collector, or using a TC16A unless you've got compatible lenses and a compatible body. If you do want autofocus in your film camera, and I have the best of both worlds by having an F6 and an FM3A, because I've got a manual camera which is for kind of pure photography where everything is manual, and then I have the F6 for film photography where I do need the autofocus. Sometimes autofocus is very, very handy. So I've got both options, which is fantastic. Obviously, if you don't have the choice of both options and you do think you want an autofocus camera, then the best thing to do is to get an AF camera and just use it on manual. It's much simpler. You can use your manual focus lenses on all of these bodies. So I don't have an F4, unfortunately, because I wanted to show you them all one after the other, but I actually don't have one. So I have to skip the F4. Some of you have the F4. In fact, I think Thaddeus mentioned he has an F4. Do you have an F4, Thaddeus? Tell me. I vaguely remember you mentioning that you did. Let's just see. F801S. Yeah, I'm going to talk about those little bodies as well. But anyway, so I have to skip one. But the F4 and the F4S, the F4S was the big version, which had the grip on the bottom. The F4 was the smaller version. Michael's got an F4. There you go. So it was the F3 bridging over to the kind of more traditional bodies that we start to see when we see the F5. The F4 sat in the middle of that. It was designed by a legend who I've spoken about a few times, Tetsuro Goto, who has worked for Nikon or up until he retired last year. I think he'd been with Nikon for about 60 years. And he designed the F4. He also designed the Nikon DF, for those of you that know that spectacular camera. The F4 was an interesting one because of its design and the way that it was laid out and its kind of whole interface. Some people didn't like it. At the time, it wasn't necessarily very well received. These days, the F4 has its own kind of cult following. In fact, it is built like a tank. Whether you've got the grip on the bottom or not, it is very heavy. I'm going to show you an F5 because that was the next one up. And the F5 is the same size as an F4S. So the F4 with the grip plonked onto it right there would be your kind of F4S shape. This is the F5. Now we start to see the more traditional Nikon DSLR design. It was the design that moved over from the F5 through the F6, the F100, the F60, F80, F90, those kind of bodies, which we now see in our digital cameras these days. So obviously all back here are all digital cameras. And if you look at, for example, a D4, because it's the first thing that I can grab, a D4 and an F5 side by side. Good heavens. D4 is quite a bit bigger. There's quite a lot going on in the D4. I suppose it has to be bigger. But that sort of cosmetic was what we started to see when we got to the F5. So if you do want a body that looks perhaps a little bit like your SLR, one thing that I like about the F6 is that I can use it alongside the D850 without really having to think too much on the thought process of where things are. You know, your shutter speed and aperture, they're all in the same place, front and back. It has a menu system, which is fairly straightforward and easy to navigate. The F5 also had a kind of limited custom settings menu, which you access through the back little panel here. And so these cameras started to kind of resemble what we're familiar with these days in the digital bodies. And I know a lot of people who, for example, like the F100. The F100 is quite small and light. Ed, yeah, exactly. Ed says F100. Andre says F100 is another film legend. It is. The F100 is a lovely camera. It was like a hybrid between the F6 and some of the smaller bodies, and it sat at the top of the consumer market, but I know plenty of pros who used F100s as well. The only downside to it in this modern day and age is that it's not compatible with the creative lighting system. I mean, if you're not going to use flash, that's not a big deal. If you are going to use your modern flashes, then you'll want an F6 or an F5. Those are the only two cameras that would be compatible with the speed light system. If you're not worried about that, then the F100 is a lovely choice. Now, I'm not just going to talk about pro bodies, but I wanted to give you that full lineup. So from the Nikon F to the F2 to the F3, then with the F4, 5 and 6, we started seeing those faster shutter speeds. We started seeing very intelligent metering systems, and pretty much whether you bought an F3, F4, F5 or F6, you would not need necessarily a backup meter. The meters in these cameras work really, really well. Obviously the F3 is an 80s camera, so it's still 30 odd years old, but it works perfectly. F5, you need the manual or quick card. Yeah, it's very complex. The little creative custom settings menu that you access through this back button here is just numbered. It doesn't tell you anything. So you have to know what all of the like A1, A2, A3, you have to know what they are, or you have to have the little card. It's very helpful. Oh, right. The F4 had all the controls on the outside. That's right, Thaddeus. Exactly. So I would say that the F5 and the F6 are the closest thing to the modern digital cameras in that the layout is kind of like those, and the F100. The older bodies, including the F4, the F3, and obviously the F2, the Nikon F, they are an entirely different film shooting experience. Everything is much more tactile. It's much less like the digital camera experience. So if you want something that you can kind of pick up alongside your DSLR and go, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this and I can work my way around it, then look at one of the more modern cameras. If you want the experience to be completely separate from your digital camera, then pick a manual body, a completely manual body, why not? Or one of the older AF bodies. So alongside all of these, Nikon always produced a consumer level camera, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. I'm getting concerned about the custom light, the creative lighting system in my F100. So Ed, you can use your flashes, no problem. You just can't use the infrared creative lighting system with the F100. So you don't get ITTL, which was an invention that was created later with the F5 and F6. That's the main difference. You can use your flashes, no problem, but you won't get quite as much intelligent through the lens lighting as you would if you have an F5 or F6. That's all there is to it. I have to ask my lovely assistant to pass me a Nikkormat. Pretty much anyone will do. They're all the same. There we go. So the Nikkormats were made alongside the Nikon F. I'm now going to just give you a little rundown on the perhaps less professional bodies, which are not to be sniffed at, but I just want to show them to you. So the Nikkormat, as you can see, it says Nikkormat on it. Actually, if I hold that alongside the Nikon F, there's not a massive difference between the size of them. The Nikkormat is slightly lighter. It was machined out of the same materials as the Nikon F. It didn't have an interchangeable prism, nor did it have interchangeable focusing screens, and you couldn't add a motor drive to the bottom. So it was kind of a stripped down version. All of the controls are around it's going to be very hard to show you this on this camera, but all of the controls and the ASA and everything like that, you can probably just about see. They were laid out, all those numbers along there, they were laid out around the bayonet. So when you wanted to use manual controls, you had to twiddle dials around your bayonet of your lens. There's nothing on the top. You see that? There's no shutter speed dial or anything. You've just got your rewind. That's it. So if you wanted something that was similarly very manual, but you perhaps wanted it to have a built-in light meter, you could have a look at a Nikkormat. Again, the maximum shutter speed is 1,000th of a second. So if you're shooting on a bright sunny day and you need a faster shutter speed, then you have to kind of get a little bit creative. And in fact, just having a look, yeah, the ASA on this goes up to 1600. So you could potentially, with some clever pushing and pulling, get around that. But 1,000th of a second is going to be the fastest shutter speed on your Nikkormats. Nikon made a hybrid. They made quite a few hybrids. There were a number of, I would say, experimental cameras. I don't know if they're experimental so much or more that they are, they were tested or tried and perhaps didn't go as well as perhaps Nikon wanted. But they did make the Nikkormat EL, which was one of the early cameras to incorporate a metering system that was fully electronic. So the battery was located behind the mirror, the meter was fully in the body. It was quite a groundbreaking camera. It didn't last as long as perhaps Nikon would have liked, because after the EL, they jumped over to the Nikon FE. Now, I have to look in the cupboard because I don't know if I've got an FE, but I've got an FA, I've got an F3, I've got an FG and an FM2. Okay, fine. I'm going to show you an FM2. So we had the FE and the FM. The FM was considered a stripped down, these are 80s cameras. So again, we jump between the 60s where we had the Nikkormats, the 70s where we had the EL just kind of slipped into there, and then the FM and the FEs, which were kind of late 70s, early 80s cameras. the most iconic of these mechanical film cameras in this range, I would say, is probably the Nikon FM2N. I'll explain why in a moment. But the FE and the FM kind of went side by side. Now, the FE had a faster maximum shutter speed. I believe, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was 4,000th of a second. Might have been 2,000th, in fact, but I'd have to look it up. And that's going to involve multitasking that I cannot handle today. But the FM didn't have any aperture priority mode, whereas the FE did. Another thing that the FE had, let me just... Do you remember I was talking the other day about the little metal flap? If you wanted to use pre-AI lenses, I always have to look down to see if you can see it. So you see that? This is the little aperture indexing lever here. And I mentioned the other day, if you wanted to use a pre-AI lens on one of these cameras, you had to check if it had this little metal flap that you could push flat so that you could mount a pre-AI lens without doing damage. The FE still had that metal little connector there, whereas the FM and the FM2 and the FM3 is all plastic, and the FE2. So if you do have pre-AI lenses and you want a camera that will work with everything, the FE is actually an excellent choice because you can use it with stop-down metering. You can use it on an FE. After the FE, oh, Ed, thank you, 4,000th of a second. Thank you very much. So the FE actually had aperture priority built into it as well, which kind of set it apart from the FN. Weirdly, when I first started working here, which feels like forever ago, but was 13 years ago, the FMs were more expensive than the FEs, completely contrary to logic, because when they first came out, the FEs were actually about 150, nearly 200 pounds, which at that time was a big difference. They were that much more expensive than the FM. So a lot of people ended up going for the FMs instead of the FEs because of the price difference. But if you do want a camera with aperture priority, and there's nothing wrong with wanting aperture priority, then you might want to have a look at an FE or the slightly newer FE2. The FE2 didn't have that. It has that plastic flange around the front. So if you are using pre-AI lenses, then you are going to want an FE, not an FE2. Hopefully that makes sense. It had a faster flash sync speed. That was the biggest deal. In terms of differences between the FM and the FM2, the FM2 also incorporated 4,000th of a second. This is actually, as you can probably see, this is an FM2T, so it was made of titanium. They did a few special versions of the FM2 because it was quite a popular camera and it was quite iconic. The FM2s can work without batteries, which is why a lot of people like them, because then they can go out into the field, and even if their batteries die on them, they can still fire the shutter. With a lot of the other cameras, you've got one shutter speed you can use in manual mode. With the F3, it's 60th of a second, and if you've got no battery in it, let me just demonstrate to you. This one has a battery in it. Okay, if it didn't have a battery in it, you could still manually fire it using that little lever at the front there. If you've got an FE or an FE2, then you can only manually fire it at one shutter speed. I believe on the FE it was 60th or 90th of a second, and on the FE2 it was 1/25th of a second, something like that. With the FM2 you can just fire it, even if you've got that's on a second. Even if you've got no battery in there and you're steering blind in terms of metering, use your phone for your light meter if you've got the app. I'll tell you which app it is in a minute. Or use a handheld light meter. You could still use the camera. So the FM2N became quite a popular option. Now that I'm in the shop, I'm being prompted. Don't forget you can contribute to the coffee fund. Honestly, by the end of this stream, I'm going to need it. It was very stressful setting it up, and I need a quadruple shot oat milk flat white. So you can contribute to the coffee fund using Super Chat. I am going to talk about budgets and price differences as well, but I want to tell you the differences first, just so that you know what I'm talking about in terms of specs before I talk about the price ranges and also lenses. Andy very early on at the beginning of the stream said, tell us about lenses, and I will explain some of the lens differences and keep an eye on the time while I'm at it. So in a very small nutshell, the FM2N is probably one of our most popular sellers. We tend to sell more FM2Ns than any other film camera. For those of you who want an autofocus film camera, or you're buying for a learner photographer, a lot of learners get put off by the fact that it's completely manual, but there is a beauty and an advantage to shooting completely manually and having basically no clue what the pictures are going to look like until you get them developed. I'm sure that a lot of you can probably relate to that. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Michael. So Baxter says, I do have an early version of the FM2N with the waffle shutter blades. Yes. A bit too good to use, so sits on the shelf. Bulky with the data back, though. Yeah, it is. I mean, this is quite a light camera as film cameras go. Much lighter than an F2 or a Nikon F or an F4 or any of those. But the FMs, FEs, FE2s, they're all kind of similar and lightweight. Just to explain a very little difference, the FM2 and the 2N were made nearly back to back. The FM2 ran for a short period of time, and then Nikon created an N version. What is the N version? Well, first of all, to tell the difference, on the front it just says FM2 still, but on the back, right in front of the serial number, it will have a letter N before the serial number. It had a faster flash sync speed. That was the primary difference. And at some point shortly after its development, it also had a different shutter mechanism. So if I just open this up here, I don't know what shutter this one's got. Okay, so this has the plain looking shutter. You see those shutter blades there? They're quite plain looking. The waffle was kind of, or honeycomb as we call it. The honeycomb shutter had a honeycomb pattern on the shutter leaves. It was said that the honeycomb shutter was not as robust as the later titanium blades, but you know, I've never seen one damaged. It's just that was what was said at the time. Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you, Ed. I have no idea how much 39 Mexican dollars are, but it sounds like a lot. It sounds like a big venti latte. Yes, so, and with manual lenses, the feel of the rubber and metal construction, there is definitely a satisfaction to using manual focus lenses, which is why I rave about them all the time, just because I enjoy the tactile feel of using them, even on digital cameras. But to that momentarily. After the FM2N, we had the FM3A. That is now my baby. I had the FM2N for a long time, but I work at Grays of Westminster. That is my main reason for changing, to be completely honest. The FM3A had a few extra additions. It had exposure compensation, like the FE and the FE2. The shutter speeds were the same. It had 0.004 of a second on it. I don't have my FM3A here, obviously, at work, but I can show you the ins and outs of that when I'm next streaming from home. It had a very intelligent metering system. The FM3A was actually discontinued in 2003. That's how recent it is, and that's pretty young by film camera standards. So if you wanted a fairly modern, let's say the Lamborghini of film cameras, mechanical film cameras, then you would go for an FM3A. They are not cheap. They do tend to be at least about £1,000 these days. They weren't that expensive when I bought mine, but they have increased dramatically in popularity over the last few years. So if you have zero clue as to what to buy, you cannot go wrong with something like an FE or an FM or an FM2, N or FE2. Any of those cameras, if you read any photography blogs, they will probably guide you in that general direction. If you're a little bit of a purist and you want something that is purely mechanical, then look at the Nikon F, look at the FM2. Those two cameras can be used without batteries, no problem. And then just take into account the shutter speeds, the maximum shutter speed that you want to be able to use. If you do want an autofocus camera, then you have to start looking at the F4s, the F5s, the F6s, and similarly, the much cheaper and still well made, but harder to fix when they go wrong, unfortunately. The F601, 301, 601, 801. In the US and Canada, they were called the N301, 601, 801. Nikon constantly changed the names of things for different regions just to make sure that they weren't going to places they weren't supposed to go to. That was their way of handling grey imports in those days. We don't do that now, sadly. So the 301, 601, 801, you can pick those up very, very inexpensively on places like eBay. I'm talking like under £60 sort of thing. They tend not to be expensive. The main downfall, I would say, of those bodies is that, one, sometimes they go sticky. The rubber, not on the F5s, but I'm just going to show you for an example. The rubber here can go very sticky on certain cameras. So you do have to check that when you're buying a secondhand camera. Also, with those older bodies, you can't really get spares for them. So if something like the battery chamber, like for example, the battery chamber in the F5, we've probably got maybe one of these left spare. But apart from that, if someone leaves batteries in their prized camera, finding a replacement battery holder is quite difficult, or if they snap the contacts or something like that. So you do have to be aware when you're buying these older bodies that not all cameras have spares available to them. In terms of checking your cameras out when you buy them, whether you buy them from Grays or you buy them from anywhere else, the first thing, we did a video, didn't we? We did a video on this, but we haven't uploaded it yet, on what to look for. That's probably a concise version. I'm going to give you the slightly longer version, but the first thing to look at is the foams. See there? You probably can't see there. So up here, you've actually got a foam, what we call the mirror baffle. And that bit of foam, yeah, I'm going to show you the back. Actually, no, on this it looks like it's fine. It looks like it refocuses and then you can see it. So right in there, you've got this little strip of foam, which when you fire the camera, the mirror hits it, and it actually just stops the mirror from getting scratched, essentially. So that's the first bit of foam to check. The second bit of foam, and I think I talked about this very, very early on in my streams, is the light seals, which are located in the back here. If you buy a Nikon F, it doesn't have those foam light seals in the back. Don't worry about it. If you buy any other camera, it does. So there's two strips of foam here and another one usually here, just to stop the light from leaking in. If this has kind of perished, you will usually be able to see it. It will discolor. It won't be proper black. It will be maybe grey, or bits of it will come off. So you do need to check that. Otherwise, you will get lovely light leaks in all your pictures. Another thing to check is the pressure plate. This little plate here, when you push it, you're just going to make sure that it actually bounces back, because that's the thing that pushes your film against this area here so that you actually get no wrinkles in your film and the film is correctly shot. Other things worth checking, obviously, are the light meter. You do have to, if you're buying a camera with a light meter, do check that it's working. Cover up the body, look through, change your shutter speeds, make sure that either the LED lights or the little needle dial, depending on what camera you're buying, there were two different types, make sure that's coming on. You can also check the different shutter speeds. Obviously, without a timer, you're not going to know if they're perfect, but for example, let me put this on 1 second, so I can tell that that's a second. The F3 actually went up to an 8-second exposure. A lot of these smaller cameras only go up to a 1 second exposure, so that's as slow as it gets. One curious thing that I find with some of the later bodies, like the FEs, is that sometimes this strips a gear a little bit, and that means that your shutter speeds are actually not in the right place. So if you fire it at a second and it sounds like it's actually firing at half a second, it just means that the gears in here have stripped. So someone has twisted it a little bit too tightly and it's shifted position. So checking shutter speeds is definitely worth doing. And then obviously, I mean, we do a little bit of a sniff test. We check that they're not moldy. We check there's no fungus in the viewfinder, all that kind of stuff. You can buy privately some pretty nasty looking cameras, so you just have to know what to look for when it's in your hands so that you don't end up with a dud. Nothing will replace putting a roll of film through your camera and getting it developed, but not everyone can do that when they're checking a camera in a store. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for your contribution to the Coffee Fund. Very, very much appreciated. Andre, can you comment on your current film choices, particularly monochrome, and how you get it processed? Okay, black and white film I have a love-hate relationship with. So I actually prefer to shoot colour, personally, on film. I love the colours that you get from really old school film. I've talked about it before. I love Kodak Portra. And Ektachrome is also very nice. But if you want to shoot black and white, X-Pan is probably the kind of most popular, I would say, in terms of very, very fine grain. I mentioned probably back when I was doing the pushing and pulling film stream that I shot a roll of Japan Camera Hunter street pan, JCH street pan, and I pulled it, I think. I'm trying to remember what I did. Yes, I pulled it. So it was 400 ASA and I shot it at 200 ASA, and that produced some very nice grungy looking shots. Obviously when you push and pull film, you do have to tell the developers that you're doing that. One of these days I'm going to process my own film. I haven't done it yet. Simon Stafford actually will at one of these days also loan me, he has a spare developing kit. If he's watching, I can put him on the spot. No, I know he's not watching because he's doing tuitions right now. But he did say, look, I've got a spare set of developing tanks and stuff. I'll loan those to you for lockdown. Anyway, hasn't happened, but I will do that. In terms of actually getting my film developed, I use a couple of places. The one that has done very well for me is Robbie's Photographic, but also Aperture UK. They do a great job on developing film. There are a few others. I mean, you can go to different places. You could try, for example, Snappy Snaps and find that one branch is particularly good and then another branch is not so good. If you're doing colour, and here's the key thing, if you're shooting in colour film, the process is effectively the same between one place and another. It's machine processed. If you're doing black and white, which needs to be hand processed, so not the C41 process, but hand developed, then it's better to go to someone you trust, just because they will be physically manhandling your film. If some film, for example, certain Ilford films use the C41 process, which means that it just gets processed the same way that colour film gets processed. It doesn't really matter where you go. They're going to stick it in a machine and it's going to do it for them. So it's whatever's available to you, really. Hopefully that helps. Right, do all the FE2s have the same shutter? Some are listed as titanium. I believe all the FE2s have the same shutter. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. It's not a camera that I've used at to any great length. Are the light seals and mirror foam still available? Yes, Steve, they are. So this is one of the beauties about a camera which has minimal electronics in it. You can easily source the foams yourself if you feel adventurous. Or if you don't feel adventurous and you don't feel like taking a pair of tweezers and pulling out the foams and then sticking new ones in, there are many places that still replace foams on cameras. Sendine Camera Repairs is one of them. PJ Camera Repairs is another. I'm trying to think of, there's Sova Wong, he does them as well. I mean, there's quite a few guys that still replace foams, so that's fine. Film is the new vinyl. Yes, it is. Is that the coffee bell? It's the doorbell, but it might as well be the coffee bell. Also, ASA exposure comp dials come loose, so exposure is wrong. Yeah, exactly. All those dials can go wrong. Film also renders so beautifully. It does. Plenty. Yes, I have noticed plenty of film on eBay. Some people you can just buy the foam for your model of camera, and then you, with a pair of tweezers, pull out the old foam and then stick in the new foam. If you're feeling up for it, then why not? Saves you a few pounds. Right, so developing black and white at home is therapeutic. Yeah, so many people keep telling me I must develop my own film. I will. And then I'll report back to you as to how it goes. You're welcome. Peak Imaging in Sheffield. Yeah, I've heard of, there are quite a few labs out there that are quite happy to develop and scan for you and all those things. And then also different people tell me that they do great jobs. So I'm sure there's more than just the labs that I've used out there. Feel free to send suggestions to each other on film developing. All right, so now let's just talk about budget quickly, because if you are buying a film camera for yourself, obviously you might have a different budget to buying a film camera for a loved one. If you've got someone who's starting out in photography, you may not want to spend hundreds of pounds, and you've got to bear in mind that not only are you buying the body, but you've probably got to buy at least one lens as well. The good old standard 50mm. I don't know if I can reach it without going off camera. I can almost reach it, it's fine. Here we go. So it's not like the green screen days where my hand just slides out of the frame. Okay, so this is just a little, what I'd call a nifty 50. It's a 51.8. This is the compact last version they did. To be honest, I prefer the slightly older version just because it's got the rubber grip. But these are relatively inexpensive. You could pick one of these up and put it on any of the film cameras. You can't very easily fit rabbit ears to these small ones. You have to get the older AI version or the very first AIS version, which had the rabbit ears or the space for it. If you're going to use an older camera like a Nikon F or F2. But if you were going to use a newer camera, you can use an AI or AIS lens. If you don't know what I'm talking about, refer to my stream from a week and a half ago where I talked about it for an hour. And I talked about all the differences between AI and AIS lenses. But I think most of you probably know by now what I'm talking about. So any old nifty 50 will be fine. There were 4 versions of this lens, possibly more. And you can buy them super cheap these days. Just, it will fit on any of your little film cameras. So that's a good place to start. Without going into a long dissertation about zoom lenses in the old days, there are quite a few zooms available for manual focus cameras. A lot of them weren't that great. I would say stick to primes wherever you can. There were quite a lot of overlaps as well, and they did of course do some professional zooms, but for the most part the primes are better. They just are. Optically they're better. So I would say stick with a prime, a 50, a 24 or a 28, something like that, and then something at the 85 end is a fantastic way to go, depending on what your preference is. As you know, I personally use a 35, I've got a 28, a 55 and a 105. I did have a 35. I've now got an autofocus version of that. But anyway, so you can kind of pick and choose what primes you want to use. But if you're buying for a loved one or you're just starting out, then a good standard nifty 50 is a great way to go just because it's so versatile. In terms of budgeting for cameras, because you've got to add the lens price to the camera, you have to be quite careful. So let's say the lens is going to minimally cost about 100, let's say minimally £100, even if you buy one of the old Series E, like economic lenses. Then your camera choice is going to be quite limited. Super cheap cameras include the Nikkormats. The Nikkormats tend to be under £200. You pop a pre-AI lens on there for £50 or £60 and you've probably got a really nice outfit for £250 tops. If you buy a Nikon F, you are looking at about £500 or £600 for a really nice one with an accompanying 50mm lens. And obviously this varies quite a lot because Greys, we have our own gradings and our gradings are quite rigorous. Whereas, for example, if you're buying something off eBay or Gumtree or Facebook Marketplace or something like that, the person that's selling it isn't going to necessarily say, oh, it's mint and it's going to actually be mint. It's more than likely going to have had some use or need some servicing or something like that. So if you are buying it privately, just ask the questions about whether or not the foams are intact, check the shutter speeds and the light seals and everything. Make sure that everything is working before you go ahead and hand over your cold hard cash. When you buy from a retailer, generally speaking, you will also get a warranty. For example, at Greys, we give a 12-month warranty on all of our secondhand at a minimum. So that's also just a little bit of peace of mind in case something goes wrong for you. So the F, you're looking at about, we do get them for about £300, but let's say between 500 and maybe max 600 if it's a really nice one. Usually not more than that unless it's a collector's item. F2s are usually a bit more, 700-ish pounds. Also depends on which version. Where's the F2 gone? Here we go. So an F2AS is going to be more expensive than the earlier versions because of the newer light meter, as I mentioned earlier. F3s sit between £600 and £700 as well. In fact, by the time you get to the pro bodies, they're all kind of in that price range until you jump up to the special editions. Like, for example, we have a couple of 50th anniversary F5s, which are a bit more expensive, as well as the normal ones, and also things like FM2Ts and stuff. Those are going to be more expensive. For the FE, FE2, FM, FM2, those kind of price ranges, those have been fluctuating massively in the last few years. They went from, when I first started working here, an FE was probably about £150. FEs now, I looked on eBay yesterday just out of curiosity, and people were selling them for like £200 for a one that we'd call like VG minus. So they have increased a little bit in terms of value. But if you find someone who is, you know, fairly happy to negotiate, then you might be able to get one for under £200. FE2s are more expensive. FM2s are usually about £300, £400. So it entirely depends on where you want to go with it and whether you want to spend more on glass or cameras. I would say spend more on glass if you can. Buy a good body. Any of these will be fine, bearing in mind there are various different caveats like maximum shutter speed and whether or not they autofocus and whether they've got exposure compensation and things like that. Bear all of that in mind. Pick your body and then spend your money on glass. That's my advice. Now, IPA gets the sticky off. Okay, we've tried lots of things for the sticky back problem, as we call it. F100s and F90s seem to be the biggest ones. I realised it was the alcohol, not the beer. Just get some IPAs in and then just do some rubbing down of the backs. Yeah, I mean, we've tried Surgical Spirit and a few other types, and some of them seem to work and some of them don't. So, but it does take off the top layer of rubber, and we don't tend to want to do that with our bodies. We try not to buy bodies if they're sticky, just because of the kind of shop we are. But if you are buying it privately and you're happy to solve that problem, then by all means get in some IPA, beer and alcohol, and give it a clean. All right. I think I'm just checking that I haven't missed any comments. No, I haven't. Okay, good. Let me know if you have any questions on any of these cameras. Obviously, I've covered, in a very short space of time, I've covered as much of the history of Nikon that I can without talking about things like rangefinders, which are a whole other thing of their own, and without getting too much into the differences between lenses. It's definitely the coffee bell. Don't forget the F2 and F3 need flash adapter. Yes, good, very good point, Andy. Thank you. So as you can probably see, except for the F3 Limited, which had a standard hot shoe, they actually need a flash adapter to go over this bit. Same with the Nikon F. So you would actually need to put an adapter on there. So if you've got flashes that you want to use on your film cameras, then just bear in mind that those older F3, F2, Nikon F, they will need a flash adapter to go on the top. These newer bodies, like the FMs, FM2s, FEs, they have a standard hot shoe, so you can put a standard flash on there. Light meter app, thank you. All right, Gordon, I have to actually find it on my phone because I don't remember what it's called. It is called meter. It's called something. It's called Lux, Lux. There you go. That's the one that I use. And it's very clever. You can tell it, I don't know how much you're going to be able to see of that, but you can tell it the aperture. You can tell it your ISO on your film, and then it will tell you the shutter speed to use. Or you can tell it the shutter speed you want to use, and it will tell you what aperture to use. So it's all very clever. Anyway, so if you want to get a light meter app, then Lux is free. I think most of them are free, to be honest. And it will tell you if you're under or overexposed as well, if you're shooting at odd settings. What about sticky stuff? I've not tried the sticky stuff remover. I haven't had a camera that I'm willing to test that stuff on. It's also quite, we've tried actually sticky label remover many eons ago, and it didn't do a very good job. So I wouldn't recommend it. By all means, buy a cheap camera. See, buy like a user off eBay for £10 and try different things. And if you have some success, let me know. I think that's pretty much everything, isn't it? Yes, it's great to be back in the shop. And thank you to everybody for joining me today. I really do appreciate your company. Thank you for everybody who has contributed to the coffee fund. Again, if you have any questions about buying film cameras, let me know. Send me an email, drop a comment. If you want a specific stream or video on a type of film camera or a specific film camera, I can do that as well. Yeah, exactly. All right, everybody, I will see you on Thursday in some form or another. And in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday and Wednesday. I will see you then, and take care.